Hello, I'm Nan Geschke, your host for the Los Altos History Show. We have Amy Heath with us this evening. Amy is the coordinator for the Los Altos History Center. Welcome, Amy. Thanks for coming this evening.
Thanks for having me, Nan.
Amy is, as I said, the coordinator for History House, but she started her career actually as a design engineer for Lockheed. He worked there several years and decided to change careers and go into museum studies and archaeology. And I understand you've also written a book on San Mateo County.
Soon to be published, hopefully by August.
Well, congratulations.
Thank you.
Now tell me, Amy, is there any carryover, between the profession of design engineering and museum coordinator or curator? Is there anything that carries over, or is this a totally different avenue for you?
Well, it's a pretty different field, really, but the thing that I think I've carried with me from my corporate career is professionalism, for one, which is applicable in any discipline. And as a design person, the way I perceive things, the way I look at things, whether it be electronic circuits or components of an exhibit, that perception that you develop as a design expert has followed over and been helpful and useful for me in terms of exhibit and visual work in the museum world.
Oh, that's interesting. Now, the History House, of which you're the coordinator, is located in the Civic Center behind the library, and it's amongst some other buildings as well, but I understand it was an old farmhouse built at the turn of the century. Is that correct? Can you give us any background on it, Amy?
Of course I can. It started out as a farmhouse. In fact, it all begins with a fellow named J. Gilbert Smith, who migrates with his mother and his two siblings from Oregon. And he comes to the Los Altos area and establishes himself here. In fact, I think his mother, Mary Shane Smith, originally wanted her children to attend Stanford University, which some of them did, but Gilbert decided to pursue his agricultural interest here and purchased, and this year is 1901, and in 1902, Gilbert purchases his first 5 acres, which was on Griffin Road, which later would become San Antonio Road, and is here where he plants his first apricots. Now, between 1902 and 1905, he starts to build his home and also purchases another 10 acres. So he now has 15 acres, which several years past, he boasts one of the most wonderful apricot orchards in the valley.
And that was about the size of apricot orchards. It was about 15 acres?
That was pretty typical, yes. And he had a very nice one, I understand. I loved his trees very much. And his house, now back to the farmhouse, he started the construction in 1902 and it was completed in 1905. And it's really a fabulous example of craftsman-style architecture. There are several other examples in town, the Shoup House for one. And the thing about this particular type of architecture, it's also known as art and crafts architecture, and it's sort of a rebellion, a stylized rebellion against the Victorian, the ornate, and the gingerbread Victorian style that was so popular at the turn of the century. And instead, craftsman architecture emphasizes real parsimonious horizontal vertical lines and good quality wood and natural finishes. And when you walk into the History House, you can see some really fine examples of this in the entryway, which is just floor-to-ceiling vertical batten, real old, beautiful sequoia redwood, the stairway, and the insert doors that weigh about 900 pounds. They pull out, and they're just one of my favorite features of the house. So the craftsman's style is very evident in his home. In fact, the stairway that he constructed in this particular house is a two-way stair, and I read, I'm not sure where, I read recently that he was written up in an architectural journal for his design of this staircase. So he's not only becomes this orchardist, but also is a very, very adept carpenter as well.
And so he, we believe, has actually built a few other homes beside his own home in Los Altos.
In the Los Altos area, yeah.
That's interesting. So he kind of supplemented his income from his apricot trees with building homes at the same time.
Yes, he was a dual career man, much like myself.
So he and his mother then came at the turn of the century, and did he have a family? Did he marry?
Well, I know he had two siblings, a brother and a sister, and actually he lived in this house with his mother, Mary Shane, just he and his mother, I believe, until about 1931 when she died. And at that time, he then decides at the age of 55 to take a bride, and he marries a lady named Margaret Hill, and she was a family friend and a school teacher. And so he and Margaret lived in the house until 1966 and 1973, which is when Gilbert and then later his wife died. But what's interesting is that he owns this really premium piece of property, and throughout his career as an orchardist, many people are approaching him wanting to buy this land because the business district is sort of popping up all around his acreage. And Joe Salamita, who is an old-time resident, talks about Gilbert saying, "I'll never let go of my trees." So he was really very passionate about his orchards. But eventually in 1954 he succumbed, and he sold almost all of his acreage to the city.
Of Los Altos, correct?
To the city of Los Altos, except for his home and about 1.3 acres that surrounds the home. He also made a condition with the city that upon his death, they would live there for the duration of their life, and then upon his death that he would give the home and the remaining 1.3 acres to the city.
That's interesting. I think you brought a few photographs along, and
I did.
I thought maybe it would be interesting for our viewers to get a look at J. Gilbert Smith and his wife. You might be able to pick that up on camera now. It's a nice photograph, and it's one of the few, I think, that exist at History House.
In their later years.
In their later years. That's interesting. Now, I know that even though the farmhouse was built at the turn of the century, that the way the History House Museum is actually interpreted is as a 1930s farmhouse. Is that correct? I mean, what was the thinking behind this? I'm kind of interested to know this, since it really wasn't a 30s construction.
It isn't a 30s construction, but that particular theme was selected for a couple of reasons. I think the most significant reason is that during the 1930s and 40s, this was sort of the heyday of agricultural and orchard development in Santa Clara Valley. And also the 1930s, being the Depression era, is a poignant time, and it's a time that reaches a larger audience. I think a lot of people come into the house and either they had experienced part of the Depression, or their mothers or their grandmothers, so it reaches out to a lot of people. It's immediate enough that you can connect to it. It's certainly easier to connect to than ancient Egypt, for example, right? It's a little bit more human that way. I also think, and I'm interpreting here, that the 1930s theme was selected because it was fairly novel at the time and unique for house museums. Things are changing now. People are adopting the theme in current day, but originally when it was conceived, it was unique.
So the 1930s conveyed the image of depression and of leaner times. What kind of times were there in Los Altos, do you think, or in this area? Were the orchardists affected directly, like some of the other farmers across the United States were, or was this area more insulated, do you think?
Well, everybody was affected by the Depression, right? But definitely think the people in Los Altos were sheltered to some extent because of their livelihoods. They were growing foods, and so those families that owned orchards always had food on the table. and the women spent a lot of time preserving and canning and drying food. So I guess you could say that in a sense life was a little bit simpler, but everybody struggled and luxuries weren't available and people didn't shoot off to the movies and they weren't eating TV dinners and things like that back then. So a lot of conscientious effort was spent to prepare, package, and preserve foods for that long 10-year period that would be difficult for everybody.
Right. I know last month we were interviewing Carol Teft, our city librarian, and she was saying that the library during the 30s was, was very, very popular because people didn't have the money to spend on entertainment, but they did have the time to spend on reading. And so I would imagine that, because people were interested in their livelihood was in farming, that they did have the time to spend on it and could reap the rewards. So perhaps there wasn't as much of an economic fallout as there may have been in some of the manufacturing areas in the United States, for example.
Oh, I'm sure, yeah.
All right. Now, tell us a little bit about History House. I know we've actually been there once we actually filmed the reopening of History House. But tell us a little bit about some of the rooms. I know that there are some really special rooms in the house.
Okay, I'm going to tell you about my favorites. I think my most favorite room in the house, aside from that fabulous entryway, that I love the entryway and the staircase and all the wood because it's very warm.
It is.
It just creates such a nice ambiance. But in terms of rooms, I think the kitchen is my favorite. And like our kitchens are today, my kitchen is still sort of the nucleus of my home. And it really, you get the feeling of that ever more so when you go into this 1930s kitchen and all the implements are spread out as if someone was using them and they just stepped out for a moment. And you can tell by looking at the sorts of implements and the amount of activity that appears to be going on in this restored kitchen that this was the heart of the home and the female was spending a tremendous amount of time with domestic activities, like I said, with all the food preparation and all the food activities. I can imagine myself, if I just close my eyes for a moment, I can imagine myself as a child sitting at the kitchen table in the bright, sunny window doing my homework while mom's, canning and jamming and all the things that a lot of the women did back then. So I think, say 90% of her time was spent there. A lot of foods were made from scratch. And I love that. That makes me feel warm and really cozy when I go into that room. So that's sort of a special room for me. And it's very sunny. It's a nice exposure. And it looks out into these grand old oaks.
I remember that we put a linoleum floor in that kitchen because linoleum was so indicative of the 1930s, where the previous floor had been a wood floor, but now it's a linoleum, and that was because the kitchen was almost almost a factory inside of a house because there was so much activity going on in it. So what other rooms, Amy?
Well, one of the rooms that I particularly like also is the living room. And when you walk into the living room of the History House, once again, you have to visualize a little bit because you do feel like you're stepping into someone else's home. But when you walk in, it's set up in such a way that you can almost imagine Mom sitting there in the corner with her sewing basket in her lap. And the radio, of course, which was the only form of entertainment that they had back then, is going, and maybe Roosevelt and his fireside chat or some epic is going on the radio, and maybe the kids are sitting over on the floor playing checkers or marbles, and I imagine Dad sitting there with his pipe next to the fireplace, probably nodding off and falling asleep. And so it's just that when you walk in, your mind kind of goes back to that time. And for me, it's a time when my grandmother was alive. That helps me to visualize that. So that's sort of a special room. It's really a nice, warm feeling in that house.
It is.
Yeah.
And it's focused on the activities of the people rather than what we often see now as a television set with a monitor.
Right.
And everybody sort of sits around it. But there was a lot of activities going on in that room, and it's really sort of displayed very well, I think, at History House.
You feel it when you walk in. You feel like, geez, where are all these people? Did they just step out? They just stepped out to Sunday church or something, and you almost feel like an intruder because it's as if they just left just a moment ago. So it's really well done that way. One
of my favorite rooms is the children's bedroom upstairs. I think that was really interpreted very, very nicely and very simply, and in some ways it is reminiscent of children's rooms today, but some of the toys, for example, I think are wonderful for children to see.
Really special. That's a really delightful room, yeah. There's some really treasures. There's some very beautiful treasures in that room.
So.
Another room that I like. Do you want to know another room that I like?
Okay.
An interesting feature about the History House is the office. And when Mr. Smith had his office, it was sort of separate from the main house. And I like this idea. This way he could do his business and work with his farm helpers without sort of involving his family. And he wasn't stomping through the house because he had a separate entrance, and neither were any of his workers. And I like that office, and you go in and you feel like you're getting to know Mr. Smith a little bit. You see his eyeglasses sitting on the desk, and an old telephone, and a beat-up old camera, and a cot with all his magazines, you know, car magazines and stuff, laying on this little area where he could snooze in the afternoon if he was tired. And I just like the way it's separately, a separate entrance and sort of isolated from the family, but still taking place at the family home.
Yeah, there's a real connection there between what was going on in the home and what was going on in the orchard around it. And this was kind of the focal point for paying workers, for example, I'd imagine, and actually contracting workers to come in at harvest time.
Right.
I imagine that's what he did then.
Yeah.
Yeah. Now, what other structures are around the History Center? I know we have the actual museum, and there are some other things that people can see over there too.
There's lots of things. We have just beautiful gardens. There's a hummingbird garden out front. And the whole grounds are actually, the whole house is surrounded by beautiful gardens and an arbor, and there's picnic facilities in the back under this great canopy of oaks. I love the old oaks. They're sort of special. And so you can sit there and have your lunch. We also have a couple of really nice outdoor exhibits. We have an old water tower out back that is actually furnished as a farm worker's home in the bottom. A lot of families back then, I understand, actually lived in their water towers during the Depression era.
They're also called tank houses.
They're
right?
also called tank houses, but we've got it done in such a way that it would give you the impression that one of the people that was working on the farm was living here. And we also have a pump that is not active right now, but it can be simulated by people that are coming through, so they can see how water was actually pumped to the tank and then out to the fields and then into the house. We have a couple of walnut hullers that work and are operated when the walnuts are available. And a nice outdoor exhibit devoted to the processing of apricots once you've picked them, laying them out on the trays and putting them in the sulfur shed for drying and so forth. And we actually do that occasionally too when the yield is good. Have some of the longtime residents of Los Altos come out in the summertime, I think June and July. Actually, I think it's July that's harvest time, and actually do that whole process. And some of those people know the process because they've all done it before, right?
I know. When we first moved out here into this area, we had 2 apricot trees. And there used to be a farm in Mountain View where you could actually go and cut your cots and sulfur them, and that's all gone now to housing. But it was a reminder, even in the 70s, that this community was very, very agricultural. So now, how did the History House actually become a museum? I mean, we know it was the J. Gilbert Smith home, and he sold some of the acreage off to the city. Did the city then take possession of the home?
He did. Now, when his J. Gilbert Smith died in 1966, when his wife died in 1973, the city acquires the entire acreage, the remaining house and acre. And this is like 2 years after the city's incorporation. And I'm trying to think now, they immediately the following year develop a historical commission, and the historical commission is tasked with transforming the house into a museum, which they do. Also during this time, in the next several years, the History House Auxiliary, which would later become the History House Association, is formed, and their responsibility would be to maintain and operate the house museum. Now, it doesn't really actually open as a museum until 1977. It was December, the 25th birthday of Los Altos. And they open the house, and it's interpreted as, it's not interpreted exactly yet as a 1930s orchardist house. It's got various different displays on part of the lower floor that are devoted to Santa Clara Valley, the development of Santa Clara Valley. So here we go down the chronology. In 1981, the house is designated as a historical landmark and the orchard as a local cultural resource. And in 1987, a California State Historical Point of Interest. The place is reopened in 1991, and part of it is interpreted now as a 1930s farmhouse. The theme is starting to develop. This is the evolution. Mm-hmm. It's then closed again in 1993 for seismic upgrade and structural retrofitting and so forth.
And then it reopens.
And then it reopens in 1994, the gala reopening, and it's fully interpreted as a 1930s Orchardist home, upstairs and down. And as it is in today's, if you were to come to today, it's as it was in 1994. Just getting better every day, though.
I know. I love it over there. I think the History House Association did a wonderful job of reinterpreting that home. And speaking of the association, it is a group of volunteers. I know that I don't know how many people are in the membership now, but I think it's like 250 people or something in that neighborhood, 250 families. What are some of the events that the association puts on, for example, to fund the center? I know that it's all privately funded. Mm-hmm. I know that they put on a crab feed, and it's one of their big fundraisers, but I know that there are some others as well.
The crab feed's a big one, and we had that in February, and there was an auction that followed. It was a lot of fun and a lot of good food. That's probably one of the main ones. And the other two main fundraising events for the museum are the crafts fair that's coming up in just a month or so.
Oh, the Americana one.
Yeah,
yes.
The American, I'm not sure the title, American Country and Craft Fair.
Country and Craft Fair.
That's a big one. And also the barbecue that's coming up in the summer. And there's some rumors that there may be some square dancers out there this summer, which would be a new highlight.
That sounds like fun.
Yeah, so, you know, come down and kick up your heels or whatever. So those are three of our major events. We also host the ice cream social that's given to honor the recipients of awards for the essay contest every year. And
the essay contest, for people who don't know, is put on, you know, it's actually sponsored by the commission, but does the Education Committee for History House actually promotes the theme or actually develops the theme?
They develop the theme.
They develop the
every
theme.
year, and it's a big task.
It is a big task because we don't like to you know, reissue these themes too often. But it's a wonderful way for children to get involved in the history of our town. And this ice cream social that you mentioned is a wonderful way to recognize these students. And I know they and their families come, and a lot of times there's teachers that come, as well as their principals. So it's really a very, very nice affair. And then afterwards they go to the city council where they receive an award. And so it's really quite a lovely affair, and I'm really glad History House, we have it at History House, because it's just really fitting, and I think the children really appreciate being there.
Well, we're proud of it too.
And I think there's some events for old timers too, isn't that right?
There are. We have a lot of special groups that come through with special requests. Like up and coming, we have a Formway reunion being planned this summer.
And Formway was?
For the old Formway machine shop in Los Altos. And so the good old boys are going to come down, and a lot of them have moved away, and they're going to come back down and celebrate in the town where they all grew up and where their businesses got started. And we do a lot of special group tours like that for not just the longtime residents, but for anybody that wants to come, and we can share and emphasize any particular part of the history or focus on the restoration or the architecture or just the history of the valley. So we do a lot of hosting of various different special groups.
That's interesting. Yeah. Now, are there any plans to expand History Center at all?
You bet there are. We've got big plans. We're not only right now in the process of expanding some of our educational programs, but we're also planning right now the development of a new building which will convert us from a History House museum to a historical, cultural, and educational complex. Now, I don't exactly remember the square footage. It's 7,000 some square feet, this new building, which is hopefully going to come into fruition in the next couple of years.
Oh, that's exciting.
Yeah, and this will allow us to expand our educational programs and do larger permanent exhibits and rotating exhibits and have reception halls and conference areas for people to meet. So it's really going to hopefully bring the community closer into History House. I think we're a little bit hidden behind the library there, although a lot of the residents know about us.
I think it's really needed too, Amy. You know, I think there's very few cultural centers in Los Altos, and this would really be a tremendous focal point, and also wonderful for the school districts, you know, both the elementary and the high school districts. Now, just to kind of recap, what we try to tantalize our viewers tonight with what goes on at the house, but when can people go to see what's there at History House?
They are invited to come. Our hours that are open to the public are Wednesdays from 1 to 5 and Saturdays from 12 to 4. Or if that doesn't work for your schedule, you can come by special appointment. I'm there most of the time, and you can call me. Also, I'd like to mention that aside from visiting the house, we also manage the archival collection for the city. So people that are doing research often come and visit me in the basement, and this is done by appointment, and we can supply them with all kinds of really good research material. So that is something that you need to call about, but you can come and set up a tour almost any time that's convenient for you. We want to see some people come out to see it.
That's great. And there's some volunteer opportunities too at History House, isn't that correct?
Lots of volunteer opportunities.
Just briefly, what
a lot of our volunteers are docenting, and that it's, you know, everybody knows what a docent does. They learn the history and they tour people through the house, and that's a lot of fun. That's a very popular volunteer activity. But if you come downstairs into my domain, I will get you involved in managing the collection, and we can do anything from computer entry to working in the vault, filing, recording, cataloging. We have lots of jobs. We have a lot of,
lots of different skills.
Oh, all kinds of skills. We can kind of channel your interests and your creativity toward jobs that are best suited that you might enjoy. That's how we keep our volunteers coming back.
Oh, that's neat. That's neat. So we've touched on a lot of different areas tonight, Amy, and I really appreciate you being able to share with us how important your work is as coordinator of all of these events and programs for History House. I know that our viewers would really appreciate having a tour, and I know that because there are signs in the library now that many more people are taking advantage of that. But I'm sure that there are many more people who don't even know History House exists. So maybe through tonight's program we've been able to sort of give them, tantalize them a little bit.
I hope so, Nan.
In getting them over to see History House.
I appreciate the opportunity.
Great.
Thanks
well,
very
thank
much.
you so much for coming tonight, Amy. We really appreciated you sharing with us and with our viewers how much is going on at History House. So
it's my pleasure.
Please go over to History House and share with Amy and some of the other docents just exactly what the history of Los Altos has been over the years. So welcome aboard, Amy. I know that you haven't been the coordinator for very long. And thank you to our viewers for watching the History Show, and we'll see you next time.